Welcome to the next lecture on urban economics. This is our second to last lecture for this series. So we are delighted to have Veronica Guerrieri talk to us today about neighborhoods and inequality.
It's an honor to be here to give this lecture to this huge crowd of people all over the world. So today I'm going to talk about neighborhood and inequality. I'm going to start from a classic observation that is now under the eyes of everybody, that there has been a dramatic increase in inequality in the US, in income inequality in particular. I'm going to focus on income inequality in the US in the last 40 years. And I wanna think about how to connect this increase in inequality to the location geography of cities. And in particular, I want to focus on another regularity that has been appearing from the data, which is at the same time of the increase in inequality, there has been an increase in residential segregation by income within US metro areas. So I'm going to provide some evidence about these two regularities, inequality increase, and at the same time increase in segregation by income within metro areas. And then the third piece of evidence that I think is relevant to think about the connection between these two facts is to think about how does it matter where kids grow up within a city. In particular, are there some neighborhood spillovers or neighborhood externalities such that if a child grew up in a different neighborhood relatively to another child, who is probably observationally equivalent at birth, then they end up with a different income when they grow up. And there is, fortunately, a lot of new microdata that have been used by Chetty and co-authors to think about micro-evidence of neighborhood exposure's effect on children's future income. So I'm going to talk a bit about that too. So with this data in mind, I'm going to then move to theory and think about models that try to link inequality, segregation, and intergenerational immobility. Okay, and first I'm gonna give you an overview of a basic theoretical model, and then I'm gonna show that there is a new growing and vibrant literature that try to use these new microdata to discipline this macro model and be able to run counterfactual and possibly answer some interesting policy questions. So let me just, I gave you a reference list of papers that are connected to this literature. Let me just group them in these slides to give you a guidance if you're interested in going back to this paper and learn more about these different topics. So first, of course, there is a bunch of paper, a huge literature measuring inequality and the rise in inequality. And here I cite just a few, but the literature the review go on and on. And you can, for example, use author et al. Paper 98 to see a lot of references to paper that think about inequality. Baccazzo and Murphy and Goldin and Katz were two of the first papers thinking about that. And then there is a large literature as well, but more in sociology, thinking about the rise in segregation. Jargovsky 96 is one of the first paper focusing on segregation by income, and then Massey et al. And Riordan and co-authors in Stanford have been working a lot on the rise in segregation at the granular level. And so it's, if you're interested in the data, it's a very rich literature, and there are a lot of data availability that help you going deeper into these issues. On the issue of intergenerational mobility, there has been also a very growing literature, mainly driven by this new availability of administrative data that allowed Chetty and co-authors to measure in a very accurate way the level of intergenerational mobility in the US and at a granular level as well. And then they have used this data also to try to give causal estimates of these neighborhood exposure effects I've been talking about. So I'm going to talk about some of this paper as well. Now, this is on the data side. On the theory side, in the 90s, there's been an interesting body of work developing a theory model to think about the link between local externalities, neighborhood externalities, and inequality. Okay, there are important papers by Benabou, Durlaut, Fernandez and Rogerson, and this paper has been used mostly to think about both the effect of residential segregation on persistence in inequality, but also to think about possible school financing reforms to kind of correct the rise in intergenerational immobility. But these are mostly theory paper, so they typically are general in some dimension, but stark in others that make it a little harder to kind of connect them to these new data. And so in response to these, kind of trying to bridge these two literature, there is another group of papers, more recent, that try to give a more quantitative, develop this type of models in a direction to make it more quantitative and use the availability of new microdata that have been growing. And so I'm gonna talk in particular, of course, about the paper that I wrote, but there is lots of other interesting paper, for example, Fabienne and Kleinberg have a very nice paper where they do a structural estimation, Graham and Zhang as well, and Durlaut and Seshadri have a first paper also that think about measuring, making a little bit more quantitative in the macro annual of 2017. So let me start with data on inequality and segregation. In these figures that I show you, but again, there is many papers that use different data sources and so forth, but I'm gonna use some census tract data on family income between 1980 and 2010. And again, I'm gonna focus on the US, although of course there are similar patterns in many developed countries. So what I'm gonna use as a unit of analysis is a metro area. And then I'm gonna use the census tract as a subunit of analysis. Okay, so inequality and segregations are gonna be measured at the metro area. And then when I talk about aggregate measure, I'm gonna think about aggregating them, waiting for the population of each metro area. Okay. So first, income inequality. Again, here I cite a wider list of paper measuring the rise in income inequality. What are common measures of inequality that people have been using in the literature? The Gini coefficient is probably the most used measure as a first cut to the data. The tail index is another common measure of inequality. And then people have been using the 90-10 ratio, 90-50 ratio, and 50-10 ratios, which is the ratio of the population in the 90th percentile versus the population in the 10th percentile, 19 versus 50, and 15 versus 10. Okay, these different measures of inequality give us a overall picture that tells us that the rise in inequality has been driven mostly by the top of the distribution. Okay, I'm gonna show you some data about that. But let me start with the Gini coefficient. So this is the Gini coefficient calculated as the aggregate of the Gini coefficient at the MSA level, waiting for population. Going from 1980 to 2010, you can see that there has been a steady increase in income inequality. Interestingly, the other common measure of inequality, which is the tail index, the blue one is the national level of inequality according to the tail index. It's a nice measure because it's very keen to be decomposed. And so we can decompose the increase in inequality measured by the tail index into the increase in inequality across metro areas and within metro areas. Okay, so the red one is the inequality within metro areas, and the green one is the inequality across metro areas. Okay, lots of literature so far has focused a lot on the rise in inequality across metro areas. There is a growing literature now thinking about the within metro areas, but this figure wanna show you that both type of increasing inequality have been important to contribute to the overall picture of the increasing inequality. If you look between the level of the within metro area is clearly higher, but what we care about here is the slope, is the growth in inequality. Okay, and you can see that between 1980 and 1990, probably the cross metro areas increase is more important, more sizable than the within metro areas. But between 1990 and 2000, for example, it looks like that the increase in inequality within metro area is actually probably even higher than the increase in inequality across metro area. So I think, I mean, this is not to say that one is more important to the other, but it's important to think that both these increase in inequality are important to get the overall picture. And we are I'm gonna focus in this talk on the within metro area. The other measures of inequality that I've mentioned are the 90-10 ratio, the 90-50 ratio. So the blue one is the 90-10 ratio, the green one is the 90-50 ratio, and the red one is the 50-10 ratio. And from this picture, you can see what I was mentioning before. This is something that David Autor and co-authors, for example, have emphasized, that the rise in inequality really comes at the top of the distribution, because if you look at the 50-10 ratio, I mean, there is no clear increasing pattern. There is actually some flat area and actually even some decreasing part. But both the blue and the green measures of inequality also show an increase between 1980 and 2010. That is the one that is more on the top of the distribution, and this is what we are going to focus on. Okay, so now let me move on measures of segregation. Again, here there is a large sociological literature that have been focusing on segregation. And I mean, of course, there is a huge literature on racial segregation. Here I'm going to focus on segregation by income. Okay, both are clearly important. There is, like Massey et al. In their paper in 2009 have emphasized that the increase in racial segregation was more important before 1970, and after 1970, there has been an even larger increase in residential segregation by income. Okay, still there is racial segregation, but the speed of increase of the residential segregation by income seems even larger. And I'm going to focus on that in particular, but clearly there are connections on racial segregation. And I think this is also an interesting topic for future research, but for today, let's focus on income. And of course, there are also relationships between that. There are some connections. The measures of segregation that people have been using are, so the dissimilarity index is probably the most common measure of segregation. And I'm going to use that as our baseline measure of segregation, but there are other measures like the H index that has been developed by Randon and Bishop, and others measures like centile gap index, neighbor sorting index, and so forth. And each measure has some advantage and some weaknesses. And so it's interesting to look into that. Depending on the question that you are after, you may think that one measure is better of the other. Okay. So let me explain what is the dissimilarity index that I'm going to use as my baseline measure of segregation. So the dissimilarity index measures how uneven is the distribution of two mutually exclusive groups across geographic subunits. Okay, as I mentioned before, as a geographic subunits, I use the census tract. And as the two groups here, because I'm interested in income, I'm going to think about the rich and the poor. Okay, so the question is how uneven rich and poor are distributed across census tracts within a metro area. Okay, now of course we need to decide how to distinguish rich and poor. Okay, you have to choose a cutoff to say this person is rich or this person is poor. And in the baseline, I mean, we are going to use different cutoff, but for example, our baseline measure, we are going to use the 80th percentile. So you're going to be rich if you are in the top 20th percentile, and poor if you are in the below that. Okay, and then I'm going to show you what happens if we have different cutoff. And then this is the dissimilarity index. J is a metro area, in metro area J. Little x is the poor in census tract I in metro area J. little y, ij, are the rich in census tract I in metro area J. And capital X and capital Y are the total poor population in metro J and the total rich population in metro J. Okay, and so the dissimilarity measures like how many rich in that census tract there are relatively to the total amount of rich in the metro area, relatively to how many poor relatively to the total amount of poor in the metro area. Okay, and gives you a sense of how spread the two groups are across different census tracts. So here, of course, there are the two extremes. One is each census tract is a perfect replication of the population in the metro area. In that case, you would have a very low zero segregation. The other extreme is that you have all the rich in some census tracts and all the poor in the other census tracts. In that case, you would have the maximum level of segregation. Typically, we will have a mix of the two, and so we will have an intensive measure of segregation. So this figure shows the dissimilarity index for the US, again, calculating the dissimilarity index at the metro area level and then aggregating at the national level, waiting for population. The red one uses the 80th percentile, the top 20th percentile as the rich. The blue one used the top 10 percentile of the population as the rich, and the green one used the top 50th percentile of the rich. Now, of course, there is a level change depending on the definition of rich and poor, and the smaller is the group of rich, the higher the dissimilarity is in general, because it's going to be more difficult to spread them out. But you can see that irrespective of the cutoff that you use, you still see an increase in the period 1980-2010. Alternative measures of segregation. So here I'm going to contrast to the dissimilarity that uses the 20% as our cutoff, percentile as cutoff. I'm going to show the H index, the blue one, and the bias corrected H index, the green one. So what is the H index? This is a measure that has been used and maybe first by Randon to think about segregation by income. It's an average of tail indexes where you use a different cutoff for rich and poor, and so you average across the different percentiles using the entropy as a weight. Okay, you can go in if you're interested in the detail. You can read the paper by Randon and Bishop, but basically the advantage relatively to the dissimilarity index is that, of course, you're going to use you don't rely on a specific cutoff for rich and poor, and so gives you a little bit of a broader overview of what segregation is. But on the other hand, it has some small sample problem, because of course, once you try to cut off for different percentile, you start cutting the population in smaller group, and so you may have problems of small bias, and so that's why they try to correct these with this bias corrected HR. Okay, so is there a connection between the increase and sorry, the thing I want to show you here is that segregation has been increasing over this period, even if we look at these two different measures of segregation. Now, how about the connection between inequality and segregation? So is there a connection? I mean, they've both been increasing over time in the US, so this may make you think, well, maybe there is a connection. So let's go a little deeper into that and try to see if there is a correlation between segregation and inequality also across space, to kind of convince us that there is something to think of in terms of mechanism that links the two. And so what I'm going to show you is, well, first I'm going to show you again the two measures over time at the aggregate level, but then I'm going to show you the correlation across space at a given point in time. And then I'm going to show you something more about across space and time, so change in segregation and inequality in different locations across space. So this is contrasting our baseline measure of segregation, that is the dissimilarity using the 20th percentile, to the Gini coefficient for inequality, and you can see that there has been an increase in both over this time horizon. Now, let's think about different metro areas, and let's focus on 1980, which is the first year where we start our analysis and where we think there has been an increase, a more dramatic increase in inequality. And so on the x-axis, we have inequality in 1980, and on the y-axis, we have segregation in 1980. Each ball is a different city. And so, for example, this is New York, and you can see that cities, metro areas actually, where you have a larger increase, larger inequality in 1980, are also metro areas that experience higher level of segregation in 1980. Okay, and so this is this relationship is significant, and there is an interesting correlation here. Now, how about changes across space and time? And so this shows the change in inequality between 1980 and 2010 against the change in segregation between 1980 and 2010 in different metro areas. Again, I forgot to mention the size of the ball is the population. Okay, and again, you can see a correlation in the change of these two measures, of these two indexes. And so metro area that experience larger increase in inequality between 1980 and 2010 have also experienced larger increase in segregation by income. Again, these are all correlation, and you can think about different stories behind that, or you can think about common factors changing that affect both these measures. But I mean, looking at this data, I've been convinced that there is something interesting about this correlation that appears no matter how you cut the data. And so that's why I want to move to another dimension and may link the two, segregation and inequality, which is intergenerational mobility. So I want to look at the change in intergenerational mobility, also how these correlate with inequality and segregation, if there is something interesting in here as well. So in order to do that, I'm going to show you some evidence from papers by Chetty. There is first, there is a paper in 2016 that tried to look at the evolution of intergenerational mobility over time. Of course, it's very hard to have a time series about that because you need a large period of data to look at a kid, the parent income, and then look at what is going to be the income of the kid when he grows up and repeat that over time. So he has some suggestive evidence of what happens over time. But of course, we have to wait to have a full time series of all the interesting measures of intergenerational mobility that he has. But overall, it shows that there has been, according to an absolute intergenerational mobility measures, meaning the percentage of children who have income higher than the income of the parents, so a measure of upward mobility. Using this measure, they show that actually that there's been a fall from approximately 90% of the children to a 50%. I'm going to show you the figure in a second. So this kind of suggests that there has been a decrease, a fading in the American dream. But the more comprehensive measures that he has are more cross-section. So in his first paper in 2014 and then more paper later, he looks at different measures of intergenerational mobility in different locations in the US and showed there is a lot of dispersion and try to find some objects that kind of correlate with this dispersion. And I'm gonna look at segregation and inequality in particular. So this is about the overtime pattern of intergenerational mobility. So this is, as I mentioned before, this is the mean rate of absolute mobility by cohort, which means what is the percentage of children earning more than their parents by cohort. This is for the children that were born in 1940, averaging on them. This is children born in 1950 and so forth. And so you can see that you go from more than 90% to roughly 50%. So there is a big decline over this period. And overall from 1940 and 1980, and there is a clear decline here at the end as well. Okay. What about intergenerational mobility at large. So he in his 2014 paper, they used this granular data, administrative data, to build an intergenerational mobility matrix that show that in general there is quite a bit of low level of intergenerational mobility. So this is what is a transition intergenerational mobility matrix? It's a matrix that look at the income of the parents and the income of the children, rank that in quintile of the relatively to the distribution of income of the population, and says, for example, let's focus on the top quadrant on the left, 1-1. It means what is the probability that a child is in the first quintile of the distribution if the parents were in the first quintile of the distribution when they were primary earner in the family. And the other interesting quadrant is the bottom right, that show what is the probability of being still in the fifth quintile of the distribution if your parents were in the fifth quintile of the distribution. So of course, large numbers in these two extreme quadrants show low level of intergenerational mobility, because it means that your parents' income affect your future income in a more dramatic way. And the more you see instead on the other extreme, so for example, what is if the parent quintile income was the fifth, in the fifth, what is the probability that your child quintile income is in the first? If this was high, that would mean that there is a good intergenerational mobility. As you can see, the extreme quadrant to the left and the right and bottom right are the ones that have the bigger numbers. So this means that there's been a large degree of intergenerational immobility. And this is a map just to show you that there is a lot of dispersion across the US. This is, again, for the absolute upward mobility measure. In the paper, they do a lot of analysis. They show relative mobility, rank-rank correlation, and so forth. And you can see that in general, these measures are pretty correlated. That's why I just show you one, but there is a lot of dispersion across different commuting zone. This paper is for commuting zone in the US. So one exercise that they do is to try to see what are important objects that correlate with this variation in upward mobility. And you can see that some of the objects are the ones that we have been focusing on. One is segregation, of poverty. This is kind of segregation by income. Of course, racial segregation also correlate quite a bit. And the other is inequality in general. So Gini coefficient, for example, mean household income, top first percentile income share. And so these are all measures that correlate. The Gini coefficient is here. The segregation of poverty is here. So these are measures that correlate between 0.4 and 0.6, so quite a bit with the upward mobility variation in upward mobility measure. Okay, so this is kind of reassuring consistent evidence that maybe there is a link between inequality, segregation, and intergenerational mobility as well. This is focusing more on segregation. I used the NLSY data together. This is together with my co-author from my paper with Alessandra Fogli, where we have restricted access to the geocoded version, and so we could split the metro area into metro area that are low segregation and high segregation. So we split them using as cutoff the 50th percentile of the segregation measure. So rank them by segregation and then take the top 50 percentile and the bottom 50 percentile and call them low segregation and high segregation metro area. And then we can rebuild the transition matrices similar to the one that I show you by Chetty. We did that with the 4 quartile instead of quintile, but the same logic applies. And for some reason, I'm sorry, this is reverse. So we have the first quintile on the left and the highest on the right. So you have to focus on the top right and bottom left to look at the ones that should be high if there is low level intergenerational mobility. So again, here the top right is what is the probability that if your parent is in the fourth quartile of the distribution, your child is still in the fourth quartile of the distribution, okay? And similarly, and you can see that if you focus on the intergenerational mobility metrics for the high segregation metro areas, these numbers are bigger. So 46.8 versus 41.8 here, and 47.3 versus 40.7. Okay, so this is again additional evidence going deeper into segregation to kind of convince us that there is a link between segregation and intergenerational mobility. A different look at data that kind of speak about the same regularity is looking at data on educational attainment of kids. So I believe these are from Randon as well. This was taken from an article on New York Times based on work on Randon. And so this is parents on the x-axis, you have parent socioeconomic status, and on the y-axis, you have the educational attainment in each school district in the US. And the way in which is measured is you have your kids about average, or you can rank the kid depending on the test score, 1 grade ahead, 2 grade ahead, or 3 grade ahead, or 1 grade behind, 2 grade behind, and 3 grades behind. Okay, and so you can see that there is a clear correlation between the parent socioeconomic data and the educational attainment, which kind of speak in favor of a sclerotic intergenerational mobility situation where the kids of the rich families are going to be better in school, and possibly this will mean that they will have a higher income in the future. Okay, so what we did is taking this data and that are the Stanford data of attainment school, and recalculate these attainment levels, average attainment levels for different metro areas, and again ranking the metro areas by segregation and calculating the gap in the test score between the kids of the rich family and the kids of the poor family, dividing rich and poor using the 20th percentile again as a cutoff. And if you do that, you can see again that metro area that experience higher level of segregation also have a more extreme gap in the attainment of the kids in school. Okay, which is again another way of looking at the data to tell us that residential segregation by income is actually related to disparity in educational attainment that kind of show and that they're gonna become basically intergenerational immobility going forward, because typically attainment at school, school attainment grades are gonna be related to the income of the children when they grow up. Okay, so now the last piece of data that I want to focus on is more work by Chetty and co-authors to look more deeply into this relationship between residential segregation and intergenerational mobility. And in particular, what they're going to focus on is trying to measure what is the effect of growing for a child, of growing up in a neighborhood on their future income. Okay, calling this neighborhood exposure effect. And in order to evaluate, of course, it's very hard to have a causal measure of that. So what they're going to do to try to construct these measures is a few different things. First, they have a paper based where they exploit this program, moving to opportunity program, that has been implemented, run in the US between 1994 and 1998 in 5 cities: Baltimore, Boston, Chicago, Los Angeles, and New York. And this program offers randomly selected families living in high poverty housing projects housing vouchers to move to lower poverty neighborhoods. Okay, and so Chetty, and Katz 2016 use administrative data to study what is the effects of this voucher on the income of the kids of the family that use these vouchers. And what is interesting is that you see that children whose families participate in the program, when they are less than 13-year-old, have an annual income that is 31% higher than the control group in the mid-20s. But this is not the case, and actually things can be reversed if you look at children, if the kids in this family that move are older than 13-year-old. This is a figure that shows that. So on the x-axis, we have age at the random assignment. So this is age of the kids of the family that use the vouchers. And then on the y-axis, you look at this effect on income when they grow up. And you can see that if the kids is 10, you have a large effect on income. This is the increase in income relative to the average income of kids in the living in the same neighborhoods. Okay, and then if you look at here is 0. So you see that if you look at 14-year-old, well, then you see a 0 effect. And actually, if you go older, you may actually have even a negative effect. Okay, so this evidence kind of suggestive that there is a sizable effect, but this effect is stronger when the kids move younger relatively than when they move older. And so meaning that the period of lower school and middle school is probably more the kids are still more able to absorb the positive externalities of these neighborhoods, while when they're older, probably they are already formed, they are already developed, so it's just going to be harder for them to integrate in the new neighborhood. Okay. Now, this is a very nice paper, but I mean, I heard Larry Katz say that, of course, it's a small sample. It's only 5 cities and it's a short time period. So in order to kind of have a broader and more reliable and robust measure of these effects of neighborhood effects, what Chetty and Hendren did is run a kind of something we can call a quasi-experiment, where they exploit, again, administrative data and look at movers across counties. Okay, so the idea is that they look at families, 2 observational equivalent family that move from the same county to the same other county, maybe when they had a kid that had a different age. And then if one family had a kid that was 2-year-old when they moved, and the other family has a kid that is 5-year-old when they moved, they kind of attribute the difference in income that the children earn when they grow up to this 3-year different exposure to the new neighborhood. And from there, they can kind of back up what is the effect of the exposure to the neighborhood since if they moved there when the kid was born. And what they find is that for children with parents, the 25th percentile of the income distribution, so the poor family, to move to 1 standard deviation better county from birth will give a 10% earning gains when they grow up. And for children with parents in the 75th percentile, so the rich family, you still see an effect, but smaller. And so to move to a 1 standard deviation better county from birth will give you a 6% earning gain. Okay, so this is of course, I mean, there are some issues with that, because you may think that there may be selection depending on when is the when the family, what is the age of the kid when the family moves. So they try to use a bunch of different exercise to control for deselection bias. They try also to use siblings, although there is no enough data to have reliable measures using siblings. You can look at the paper, but I think as of today, this is the best measures of exposure to neighborhood that we have available. So the other thing that they use in these papers is that they try to look at predictors of place effects for poor children. And so again, what are the good neighbors and what are the bad neighbors? Because they don't start with some fundamentals, they just decide what is a good neighbor, looking at the income of the kids when they grow up. So then they can back up and look at what are the characteristics of these neighbors that endogenously show up as good neighbors and bad neighbors. And so basically what you can see is that clearly racial segregation, again, is something that is correlated with the neighborhood that give you lower income in the future. Gini coefficient, so more inequality is bad. So neighborhoods with lower inequality are better in the dimension of the income of the kids when they grow up. And again, income and neighborhoods with a lower level of segregation are better. And then you can see other features like fraction of single mom, fraction of foreign born, and so forth. So there is a new randomized control trial that, because this was a kind of a quasi-experiment, the first move into opportunity was a small program. So what Raj, Chetty, and co-authors have done more recently is that they were able to run a randomized control trial in Seattle and King County that is pretty large, and try to again give some housing voucher to the recipients, to people who to move to high upward mobility neighborhoods. The other thing that they and try to see what is the effect of that. The other thing that they do in this paper is trying to understand what is that really helps this family to move to this higher opportunity neighborhood. And they actually, in their experiment, they complement these vouchers with some kind of effect, like a customized help. For example, customized search assistance, landlord engagement, and short-term financial assistance. And so they show that these customized help in the moving has an important role together with the voucher. So it's not only about the voucher itself, but it's also about information and help with the search of housing and so forth. In any case, they show that this intervention as important a sizable effect. In fact, that intervention increased the fraction of families moving to high upward mobility neighbors from 15% to 53%. Okay, so they conclude that it will be important to better design housing, affordable housing policy by complementing this policy with some form of customized assistance to the families that move to high upper mobility areas. So I'm ready for some questions before the break, if you have any.
Hi, Veronica. Yeah, thank you for a great talk. We have a bunch of questions coming in the Q&A box. So I'm just going to read out a few to you. I'll take them one by one. Yeah. So we are starting with a question by Andre Portloguer, who is asking effectively about the difference between nominal and real inequality across cities, and what, whether your graphs were already adjusted for local price indices, and kind of how that would change the analysis, and if we can learn something from that, the difference between nominal and real.
Absolutely. So we did not adjust for that, and that is for sure something that is interesting when we think about across cities inequality. So that's definitely something to keep in mind. I'm focusing here within metro area, so I didn't push that analysis, but it would definitely be interesting to look into
that. Okay, thank you. And then there's another question on the MTO program, which is kind of about these negative effects for older children that you showed. And the question is whether you have any thoughts on the mechanisms behind that, whether that may be related to the isolation from other children in richer communities, if you come in as an older kid, or.
Yeah, so I mean, again, here it's all there is no evidence about that, so I just speculate how I think I interpret these results. But it is probably true that if you take a kid when it's like a 3-year-old, and if you put it in a nursery school or in a kindergarten when it's 5, the kid still doesn't have any friend. No kids have many friends, so they start to interact better integrate better with the community. And when you're better integrated, you can absorb better what the teacher is teaching, or they imitate the social there are social norms that make you more integrated. And so if other kids have better examples from the family, for example, or if they get more access to extracurricular activity or support, this can kind of help also the other kids to absorb some of that. If you take a kid at 14-year-old, especially from a poor family, probably this kid has already a lot of responsibility in his family. He has already a group of friends. He's already developed his own personality, and so it's much harder to integrate him remove him from a neighborhood where all his friends are and integrate him in a different neighborhood. So I believe that the effect of the school for these kids is much harder, because there is actually a nice paper I didn't mention here by Agostinelli, who is at the UPenn, that look at some surveys that ask kids, who is your friend? And so they look at the 4 or 5 friends per kid, and look at people that have I think mostly people that have been either Black people that moved to a mostly white high income school, and try to see if the friends change or not. And he finds that actually, if you are a poor income family, you tend to hang out with poor income family kids, even more people available. And if you are a Black kid, you tend to hang out with Black kids. So there is a natural, and I think these patterns are stronger the older you are.
There is a question here from Michael Finnegan about the causal effects in Chetty, and I know that Matt Turner here has a related question. So maybe Matt, why don't you ask in person?
Okay, thank you. So Veronica, I'm finding this super interesting. I'm wondering, you started by showing us patterns in aggregate inequality and sort of at the MSA level and nationally, right? And then we have this micro data on the effects of sort of treatment effects. Do you have a sense for the extent to which we can account for the aggregate numbers, the aggregate change in inequality, with the treatment effects estimated in Chetty? Like, how much of this is just poor people sorting into poor places, and how much of it is a causal effect of places on people's outcome?
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess it is hard to answer this question. I mean, I guess that in the second part of the lecture, what I'm gonna do is take these, I'm gonna show you a paper of mine where we actually take this number that Chetty shows as a good number to tell us what is the neighborhood exposure effect, and try to infer from that, if we discipline a model with this neighborhood spillover with that number, try to see how much of the inequality that we see can be attributed to this effect. And now, of course, there is some sorting going on. I mean, in Chetty, I mean, they try to control for everything that is observable. So they look at the effect beyond the fact that it's a poor family that moved to a poor neighborhood, right? So they try to take 2 poor families that are observational equivalent and move them from the same county to the other county, and try to see how much of that is due to the exposure to of the kids to more years of schooling of that. But
that's not the second bit's not quite my question. I'm not questioning whether, let's stipulate to the Chetty effects being causal, okay, right? When we see the increase in MSA level inequality, it could have 2 effects. One is that the people who live in a place are having outcomes that are correlated with initial conditions. And the second is that people are sorting more precisely across neighborhoods.
Yeah, so
right?
I'm gonna, I mean, yep.
That's all. So the even if we stipulate to the causal effect, the aggregate numbers could still reflect,
yeah,
even if we
So so hopefully you will enjoy, and we can go back to a question at the end of the second part of the lecture, because I'm gonna actually try to do that, try to disentangle how much is the sorting effect, how much the increase in inequality that we have seen is due to the sorting effect, and how much is instead due to a simple increase in inequality that doesn't have to do anything with the sorting effect. And I will show you how I do it, and maybe we can chat more at the end of the next part of the lecture.
Great, Veronica. I think there's one more question that we may briefly address, which is that the Moving to Opportunity study, they also found these big differences between of the treatment effect between different genders, and I think also by race, and whether you had some thoughts on the mechanisms that behind that.
I mean, I haven't thought about that. So I imagine that it's. So I haven't. So I don't know. Like, we can go back to the gender. I don't even know about the gender. So in which direction it goes? Is it the female being having a stronger effect or a smaller effect? Of course, I mean, we can go back and look, but there is probably a complication with a female, which is when you calculate income when they grow up. There is, of course, all the dimension about female labor participation. And so it is not necessarily true that female that better, maybe even absorb better the spillovers from a neighborhood, then end up having a higher income. But then maybe be due not to the fact that they're not absorbing better, but to the fact that they're not going to go to work, or they're not going to exploit their full capacity because of social norms, or because of family reasons, or because they are going to have kids and so forth. So it would be interesting to look more into the data for that, but I don't have an answer right now. And same thing for the Black people. I think this is a great area of research. I have not looked at the data, so I don't have a good view of what are the subtleties there relatively to white people.
Yeah, actually, there's maybe one more question we can do just before the break, which you can answer kind of quickly if you want, which is about, you mentioned the NLSY data, where you can obviously like follow people over time. So the question is whether we have evidence that local residents are moving out of a treated area because they think poor families are going to move in, and that's going to change the composition in ways that.
Sorry, say that
because poorer residents are being moved in by this MTO experiment or by similar experiments. So do we actually do? Yeah.
I see. So if those data embed the moving to opportunity, so I think they do, and so we didn't control for that. But I think these are very small numbers, so I doubt that they are affecting the total in a significant way, the average of the whole MSAs. But it's interesting. We could definitely redo the exercise, just dropping the 5 cities that have been where the Moving to Opportunity program has been implemented, and show that's easy to do. We could do that.
All right. Thank you very much. I think we're going to take a 5-minute break, and we'll be back at 2 minutes past 12 Eastern time.
Welcome back, everybody. So now that I kind of some data regularities, I talked about inequality, segregation, and intergenerational mobility, I want to take a step back and mention an interesting body of literature, theoretical literature that boomed in the 90s and was thinking exactly about linking these different objects. So thinking about a relationship between segregation and inequality, and in turn also intergenerational mobility in general equilibrium frameworks. And the seminal works in this respect are the 2 papers by Benabou, Durlaut, and Fernandez and Rogerson. So these are very nice papers. I highly recommend you to look at them. There are 3 important ingredients that are typical in this set of models that are some differences, but there are these three common denominators that create the important link between segregation and inequality. One is that you need some endogenous residential choice to think about the endogenous evolution of segregation, of course. Two, there is some form of human capital accumulation, which is important to think about the endogenous effect of a neighborhood spillover on your education accumulation, and so on your future income if you are a kid. And three is there is some form of local spillovers. So some dimension in which living in a neighborhood, it's good for future income, which is what basically Chetty et al. Argue with their measurement. And local spillovers, so Chetty et al., Chetty and Andrew, for example, in the quasi-experiment paper that I mentioned, they don't take a stand, as I mentioned, on what is a better neighbor and what is a worse neighbor. They just look at what are the neighborhoods where if kids grow up have a higher income when they grow up. So why is that? Of course, I mean, there is a lot of another big set of issues that I think it would be very interesting to try to address, which is where these spillovers come from, where these neighborhood externality come from. And there are some usual suspects there, but of course it would be nice to have more data on which effect is more important. One obvious reasons why growing in a neighborhood may matter for your future income is because of the way in which the public school system is designed in the US. It relies a lot on the local taxation of the school district, and so of the area where you grow up. So the quality of the school depends on how rich is the area where the school is, because this affects the revenues that can be used to improve the school itself. So of course, this creates some local spillovers. The other is peer effects. So it may be that just being closer to kids that have a better opportunity at home, more books, their parents help them more, is going to have some good effect on kids that have not the same opportunity at their house. Role models, social norms, of course, crime also. It's if you to go to school, you cannot go to school because there is a high criminality, or you have other opportunity that is something that affect your engagement in the human capital accumulation. And also networks can be embedded in some form of local spillovers. So for example, job networks, like if you go to school with the son of a hedge fund guy, when you maybe grow up, you can get a job at that hedge fund. Or if you are in school with somebody who is going to become the CEO of a company, maybe when you grow up, even though you don't have good school attainment, you're a friend of the person knows you better, and so you're going to work for that company, and so forth. So also social network are going to be on the labor market, maybe an important reason why there are these local spillovers as well. In any case, whatever it is, if there is some local spillover in human capital accumulation, endogenous residential choice, and human capital accumulation, well, then you are going to get in all these papers some form of residential segregation or stratification, or some of these papers call it, by income, that naturally arise because of this local spillover effect. And it may arise, the general equilibrium price that generates this segregation may be different in this paper. It may be taxes. For example, if you focus on the public school system, it may be house prices. But there is some form of a general equilibrium price that kind of generate this segregation, as I'm going to show you in a second. Okay. And so the common theme of this papers is that residential segregation exacerbates inequality both in education and in income. Okay, so like building on these papers, on these models, there has been a group of new papers trying to exploit the fact that there has been a lot of this growing new data, micro data, used to measure intergenerational mobility, exposure effect, neighbor exposure effects, and so forth, and try to quantify this effect. And going back to the question that I had before, try to understand how much of, for example, the inequality, the rise in inequality is due to this sorting effect rather than to a mechanical effect. And I'm going to focus on the most of the part of the second part of this lecture on a paper I wrote with Alessandra Fogli that asks exactly the question, how using such a model and kind of exploiting this new estimate by Chetty and Andre to discipline the model, can we answer the question of how much residential segregation contributed to amplify the rise in inequality in response to underlying shocks? Right? So our reasoning is that there is some underlying shock that generates this rise in inequality, and there are there is a standard common suspect that people have emphasized, and there is a lot of consensus that is a part of the story, is that there has been a rise in the skill premium, so skill bias technical change. So we are gonna assume that this is the main shock, and say, okay, if in 1980 there has been an increase in the skill premium due to technological the type of technological progress that we have experienced, how much inequality and segregation we get in response to this shock, and then we can use the model to tell us, to run counterfactuals and tell us how much of this increase in inequality can be attributed purely to this amplification mechanism coming from the segregation effect. And what we show is that you don't see the last bullet, you don't, unfortunately, I don't think you see in the slides, but what we show is that the segregation contributes to roughly 28% of the increase in inequality in our calculations. So let me show you the model first, and then how we try to bring the model to the data, and how we try to use this new data to answer this question about inequality. So we have overlapping generations of agents who live for 2 periods, children and parents. When somebody is a parent, has 2 important characteristics. One is a wage, WT, and one is that he has a child, he or she has a child with the ability 80. So 80 is the innate ability of a child. And we are going to assume some persistence in the ability of the kids. So we assume that log A follows an R1 process with some correlation, high correlation rho. And then we are going to be interested in the joint distribution of wages and innate ability, okay, and how this is going to evolve over time. This is going to be an endogenous object. So on the geography, in the paper, we assume a 2 neighbor structure. So our model is a model of an MSA, so of a city, and we are going to think about 2 neighborhoods, A and B. Okay, and each agent living in a house of same size and quality. Okay, so we simplify the housing side and the geography side a lot to get some mileage out of the segregation and so forth. And I'm gonna show you, but of course we could enrich the model with multiple neighborhoods and with housing dimension and so forth. I think that those would be interesting extension. But here, let me give you the baseline model and the main result with this baseline. So we're going to call RTN, the rent in neighborhood N at time T. So everybody's renting, okay, and all houses, homeowners out of the picture here. And we are going to assume an extreme assumption on supply. And again, we're going to make some stark assumption, but the model is generalizable in this dimension. What we are going to assume is that in neighborhood A as a fixed supply of houses, H, and the neighborhood B as a fully elastic supply of houses. Okay, so this is the simplest assumption we can make to get our results. But of course, you could have a more general supply, upward sloping supply of houses with some elasticity in both neighborhoods, and the model would go through. What you cannot have, the only thing that you cannot have, is that both neighborhoods are fully elastic, because our mechanism of segregation is going to be based on this general equilibrium effect on prices. So prices, house prices need to respond to people that want to move to the neighborhood. So we need some form of inelasticity in at least one of the neighborhood. Okay, and here we are going to assume that there is one neighborhood that is fully inelastic. So the marginal cost of construction in neighborhood B is equal to 0. So basically, we are going to have that the rent in neighborhood B is going to be equal to 0 for all T, and we can focus purely on RTA, that is going to be our general equilibrium price, which is the rental rate in neighborhood A at time T. Parents can directly invest in education, and education can be low or high. Oops. Low or high, okay? And we assume that the cost of getting low education is 0 and the cost of getting high education is tau. Now, importantly, how is the wage of the child be determined? And here we assume that this is a function omega, for which I'm going to assume some specific functional form in a minute, but I don't need that for the more general theoretical result. And the important is, what are the objects that affect the wage of a child when he grows up? The wage of the parent directly affect that. The ability of the kid, if the kid is smarter, more talented, is going to get a higher wage when he grows up. If he has richer parents, he may have more help at home and then to study, to do homework, and so he's going to have a better return to education and better income when he grows up. Education, the higher is the educational level, the higher the income when he grows up. Some random shock epsilon t that generates, that kind of absorb everything that is not here and generates some smoothness in this function. And then this STN, what is STN? Is the neighborhood N spillover. So the assumption is that this, if the child grows in neighborhood N, then ST is the level of the size of the spillover in the neighborhood, and the more positive, the larger the spillover, the higher is the return to education of the kid, and so the higher the income when it grows up. Okay, so so first of all, let me say one note. Here I introduced the wage of the parent directly in this function. Theoretically, I don't need that because the wage of the parent indirectly is going to be important for the wage of the kid directly because of the choice, endogenous choice of the parent of the education and of the neighborhood where he grows up. So choosing to live in a better neighborhood is a form of investment also for the parents in the education of the kids and in his future income. Okay, I just introduced this direct effect of the wage of the parents because to match the data, we see that there is a lot of persistence, and we need that on top of the choice of the neighborhood and on the top of the choice of the level of education, actually the income of the parents has an important effect on the income of the kids. Okay, so theoretically we don't need that, but quantitatively we do. Now, what is this spillover? How do we model this spillover? So the important thing is gonna be that this spillover, we assume that this spillover is endogenous, is an endogenous object, depends on the distribution of kids, of families who live in the neighborhood. And this is gonna be the interesting thing, an interesting thing that is gonna generate a feedback effect. So we can, what we are gonna assume is that the spillover is equal to the average income of the kids, so is equal to the expected average future income of the kids who grew up in that neighborhood. Okay, so what does it mean? I mean, you can interpret that as a average human capital accumulation in the neighborhood that that has a spillover on the individual human capital accumulation. But what is this is even broader than that, and then can, if you want, embed also the quality of the school or the network structure and so forth, because what is important is that the wage of the kids and the future wage of the kids depends on two things endogenously, we will see. So depends on the wage of the parent and the ability of the kid, right? Because SPN is endogenous, so it's going to depend on the wage of the parents and the ability of the kids that are going to affect the choice of N. Education is endogenous, is also depend on the ability of the kid and the wage of the parents, so it would affect the level of education of the kids. Epsilon is a noise variable. So the only really two state variables that affect the future wage are the wage of the parent and the ability of the kid. So what we will show is that this is an increasing relationship. So the richer is the parent, the richer is the kid, and the more talented is the kid, the richer the kid is going to be. So what this spillover tells us is that neighborhood where you have richer parents and smarter kids, you have a stronger spillover. And that's the only thing that this mathematical formulation shows us. And so this means that it could be because there is public schools there that are better, because if richer parents are there, they're paying higher taxes, the public schools are better, and so you have a higher spillover. You could be because you have better social norms, either because the parents are richer and create more educated, and so they kind of instruct the kids to care more about education, and these spillovers goes to people, kids of families that are not as much educated as these ones. It could be because of peer effects, if the ability effect is more important, okay? So it can embed a lot of different explanation, and of course the shape, the specific functional forms of the omega object, and it's going to be important to determine that. So, and the strength of the spillover in the wage dynamics is going to be very important to determine that. So we are going to see how we are going to try to discipline this in the data later. Okay, so the parents' preferences. What are the preferences? Parents care about their own consumption, and they care directly about the wage of the kids when they grow up. This is a kind of a standard way of formulating preferences relative using this literature that I've shown you. Durlaut, Benabou, Rogerson, Fernandez and Rogerson, and so forth. And it's a shortcut, clearly. You could have a more like infinite horizon view where you care about directly the consumption of your kids, you care about the consumption of their kids, and so forth. The important thing is that if you do that, you want to impose some borrowing constraint. Right? So this is kind of a shortcut that allows you to not impose borrowing constraint, some form of borrowing constraint, because you care directly about the wage of the kids. But the important thing here is that you don't want the parent be able to borrow against the talent of the kid. Because here, for simplicity, we assume that we know the parent knows the talent of the kid. Okay, so we don't think it's reasonable to think that you can go to the bank and say, my kid is super smart, give me money to move to these neighborhoods where the schools are great. And so, of course, we need to impose some form of borrowing constraint, and this is a simple way of doing it. Okay, U is concave, G is increasing, and both are continuously differentiable. So a parent is going to choose consumption, is going to choose the neighborhood where they live, and is going to choose the educational level of the kid. So this is the optimization problem of the parent. They maximize their utility subject to a budget constraint. So they have their own income that they can use to consume, to pay the rent where they live, and to pay for education if they decide to give high education to their kid. And this is they also maximize the utility, knowing that the wage of the kids depends on their choices. It depends on their choices of the education of the kids, and importantly, it depends on their choice of the neighborhood of the kids, because by choosing the neighbor, they're choosing a spillover effect that is going to affect the wage of the kid when it grows up. Okay, so and they're going to take as given the rental rate in each neighborhood, and they're going to take as given the spillover level in each neighborhood. So how do we define an equilibrium? So for a given initial joint distribution of wages and ability, an equilibrium is going to be a sequence of neighborhood decisions, educational decision, rental rate in neighborhood A, spillovers effect in both neighborhoods, and joint distribution of WNA at each point in time, satisfying the agent's optimization problem that I've just shown you. This satisfying some consistency in the spillover, so the spillover needs to is endogenously determined according to the equation I just showed you. The satisfying housing market clearing for neighborhood A. In B, there is fully elastic supply, so it doesn't matter. But for A, we want to make sure that the fixed supply of houses is equal to the demand, so to the distribution of people who decide to live in A, whose neighborhood choice is A. Okay, and of course, this is going to affect the price or the rental rate in that neighborhood. And then such that the wage dynamics are consistent with the choices, optimal choice of the parents. So with the N and the E, the educational choice. Okay, what assumptions we are gonna make for our results to be true? First of all, we're gonna focus on potentially here there are multiple equilibria. For example, potentially there is an equilibrium where both neighborhoods are the same and there is zero prices in both neighborhoods, rental rate in both neighborhoods, and the composition of the people is the same. We don't want to focus on that equilibrium. We are going to focus on equilibria with the rental rate in A that is positive for all time t. And this means automatically focusing on equilibrium where neighborhood good A is the good neighborhood, is the neighborhood where the spillover is higher for all time t. Okay. And with this in mind, let me make two assumptions. So I'm going to make a first assumption here again for simplicity. We have this extreme, we are going to have an extreme version of this omega function. And we are going to assume that is a constant in the spillover and in the ability when the kids choose a low level of, so the parent choose a low level of education for their kids, meaning that if you have a low level of education, the spillover doesn't matter much and your talent doesn't matter much. But when you choose a high level of education, then your wage is going to be increasing in the spillover and in your talent. Okay, and the other assumption is that the composite function G of omega is increasing differences in A and S, A and E, WNS and WNE. So there are some complementarities between spillover and ability and education, and spillover and wages and education and wages. And I'm going to show you now, explaining the mechanism where these assumptions, why these assumptions are important. So with this assumption, we can characterize the equilibrium with two non-increasing cutoff functions. And again, I'm using this binary education model just for explaining the mechanism, but then in the quantitative analysis, I'm going to extend it to a continuous education choice. But for now, we have two cutoff functions. So one is the high education, low education, so the educational decision, and the other cutoff function is going to determine the neighborhood of choice. So I'm going to show you this proposition with a graph. Okay, on this graph characterize the steady state, the equilibrium in our model. On the x-axis, we have the ability of the kids. On the y-axis, we have the wage of the parent. Okay, and again, there are two cutoff functions. W hat of A is the educational choice function, and W hat of A is the residential choice function. Let's start with the educational choice. Educational choice is decreasing. And so if you are on the left of it, it means that you choose low education for your kid. If you're on the right of it, you choose high education. So who is choosing higher education? People who have more talented kids or richer families. Why? Well, because if you're richer, you are more willing to pay for the higher cost of education. And if you are more talented kids, and here is important the complementarity between talent and education, you know that the return to education is higher, so you are more willing to pay for it. Okay. Now, how about the residential choice? Again, it's a decreasing function. So if you are on the right of it, you choose neighborhood A, the good neighborhood. If you are on the left, you choose the bad neighbors, neighborhood B. And again, you're gonna be more willing to choose the good neighborhood if you have a more talented kids or if you're richer. And why is that? Well, again, the rental rate in B is 0. So if you are richer and rental rate in A is positive, we say we are focusing on the equilibrium where this is the case. So if you are richer, you are more willing to pay to live in a better neighborhood because you have more resources. On the other hand, if you have a more talented kids, there is also complementarity between the talent and the spillover that we emphasized. So more talented kids are gonna be able to exploit more the positive spillover of the neighborhood. And so this means that if you have a more talented kids, you're more willing to pay for the higher rental rate in that neighborhood. Let me make right away an important caveat. Notice that the assumption we make, and unfortunately it's hard to find the data to kind of verify that, but it's that there is a complementarity between the spillover, in the neighborhood spillover, the expositional effect, and the innate talent of the kids. But it doesn't mean that, but it actually, it's in the model, I'm gonna show you something that is true in the data and is true in the model, is that actually the spillover is gonna have a higher effect, stronger effect on poorer family than on richer family. And I'm gonna try to explain that this is because of a selection effect, but let me just, don't have in your mind that talent means income. It's important that it's a different dimension. It's true that there is a correlation between talent and income, but of income of the kids, but there is an important distinguish between the income of the parent and the talent of the kid, okay? All right, so functional forms, we are going to assume log utility. We are going to assume a specific wage function. Okay? And the important thing is that this wage function satisfies the assumption that we made, meaning that the spillover is complementary to ability and education. Okay, and that if there is a zero spillover, then we are going to have some basic level of income that depends still on your ability and on your education. Okay. Now epsilon is IID and log normal, and with this in mind, we are I'm gonna explain our main exercise. So our main exercise first, theoretically, I'm going to explain the mechanism and then I'm going to show you quantitatively. So our main exercise is going to be, let's assume that there is a skill bias technical change improvement. How can we represent that? How can, as a shock in this model? Well, we can assume that as an increase in this parameter eta, because an increase in eta means an increase in the return to education. Okay, so an increase in the skill premium is going to generate an increase in the skill premium. And then in the data, we are going to try to choose an increase in eta such that we map the increase in the skill premium that we see in the data. But the question is, theoretically, what happens when eta increases in this economy? Let me show you again this with a graph. Okay, so when eta increase, so the skill premium increase, let's focus on the partial equilibrium effect first. So first of all, let's fix spillover. And let's fix rental rate in A, okay? Now, if there is a higher return to education, everybody wants to get more educated because there is a higher return, everything else equals. So the educational cutoff function is going to shift to the left, so everybody wants to get more education. But also the residential cutoff function is going to shift to the left. Why? And here is important, the complementarity between the spillover and the education. When there is a higher skill premium, there is a higher return to the spillover effect. And so it's more important that, I mean, you are more willing to pay more to live in the neighborhood with a higher spillover. So if the cost is the same, everything else equal, more people want to live in that neighborhood. Now, of course, this cannot be an equilibrium because we know that there is a fixed amount of housing in neighborhood A. So prices have to adjust. So what's going to happen? There is too many people who want to live in A, the price of living in A has to go up. So the rental rate is going to go up so that some people are going to go back to B. But the question is, who is that is going to move back to B? I mean, who is that is not actually moving to A because it's a simultaneous thing. And the interesting thing is that because it's the rental rate that increase, I mean, the ones that are not going to move to A are going, the ones that kind of suffer are the kids, more talented kids from poorer family. So this red line is going to shift back, but it's going to shift back from this position here in a tilted way. Okay, and it's going to shift in a tilted way so that it's true that it's going to be more rich families that are going to move to A because now the return to education is higher. But the poorer family who actually would like to, because they have the poorer family who are there with talented kids, they would really like to be there even more because the return is higher and they have a talent kid, so there is a complementarity there. But the cost of housing is too high and now they cannot afford that, so they're going to be forced to move to B. Okay, so this is going to be the mechanism of what's going to happen. So so this means that there is this shock that generates more inequality, and by mechanically, if there is higher skill premium, you're going to have the skilled kids who are the high income one are going to get higher income, and the low income kids are going to get even lower income. But this is going to generate more segregation by income because now you're going to have the neighborhood that is already richer is going to become richer because of this effect. So you're going to have higher segregation by income. And how this is going to feed back in even more inequality? Well, there are what's going to happen now. If the two neighbors, if there are richer people in the neighborhood A, now the spillover endogenously is going to change. And there are two directions in which it could change. It could change because there are more richer people. So we know that more richer people makes the spillover stronger because makes the expected wage of the kids who live there higher. But there are less talented ones. So for that direction, actually could make the spillover smaller. But actually, we're going to show that quantitatively, the income effect is going to dominate, and the gap in the spillover between the two neighborhoods when there is higher residential segregation by income is going to become even larger. The richer neighbors is going to become even richer. Public schools are going to become even better. Social norms are going to become even stronger. So the spillover is going to become stronger. And this means that the rich people who live there are going to have kids who are going to have an even higher return to education. So they're going to have an even higher income when they grow up. And the ones that are pushed back in B are going to have an even lower income. And so this is going to increase inequality even further. Okay. So this is the mechanism. Let me move to the quantification of this mechanism, how important it is. So in the extended, before doing the quantitative analysis, we extend the model into direction. First of all, as I mentioned before, we are going to have a continuous educational choice. This is important because, of course, if the choice of the parents is only high, like college or no college, well, then there is no much room for being richer affecting the level of education of your kids, while we know that there are many dimensions in which financial investment can help improving the quality of the school, the extracurricular activity, tutoring, and so forth. And so we want to give that extra dimension of education there. And then the other thing is that we are going to add the residential preference shock, because so far in the model, the only reason why you want to live in A is really purely the spillover effect. So we want to have a little bit more realistic model where you may have a preference shock because maybe the rich neighborhood is closer to a lake or other amenities. So we do that. We introduce people enjoy consumption more if they live in A with some probability theta. So this is the idiosyncratic preference shock. And then we have an endogenous educational choice that is continuous. And the important thing is that it's still increasing in S. The higher the spillover, the higher the level of education. Okay, so let me describe the main exercise. So we're going to calibrate the model steady state to 1980, to features of the US economy in 1980. And then we are going to assume that in 1980, there is going to be an MIT shock, a one-time unexpected permanent change in eta, the parameter I've shown you before that affect the return to education, to match the skill premium increase between 1980, where it was 0.38, to 0.54, what that was in 1990. And then in terms of periods, we're going to interpret one period as 10 years, because you can interpret, this is a overlapping generation model, so you can interpret the period as the working age, which is more like 30 years, or as education age, which is between 10 and 15 years, depending on which school you are counting. Given that our accent on the educational part, we're going to choose to go with the schooling, and given that census tract data are available every 10 years, we are going to pick 10 as the right number. And then we're going to look at the responses of inequality, segregation, and mobility that the model implies. And then we're going to run our counterfactual to try to assess how important is segregation in amplifying inequality. So these are the calibration targets. So we are going to calibrate the model to match the Gini coefficient inequality in 1980, the one I've just shown you, the dissimilarity index in 1980. I saw there was a question why you only use the dissimilarity index. So far, I used it for expositional purposes, but actually in the model, we also match the H index in 1980. And then we try to match the average income in neighborhood B relatively to neighborhood A. How do we define neighborhood A and neighborhood B? So we rank the neighborhoods based on the income of the population in the, the census tracts, based on the income of the population in census tracts, and then we cut off the richest X ones, so that we pick X so that the size of the neighborhood A is equal to the estimated H, which is the size of the neighborhood A in the model. Okay, and then we target the difference between rental rates in these two neighborhoods, so defined as I did, normalized by the income in those neighborhoods. We target the rank-rank correlation, take the number from Chetty, and then this is the important part. Well, we target the return to college, the skill premium in 1980-1990, as I mentioned, to estimate the size of the shock. And then this is the important thing. We are going to use Chetty and Randon to target, to try to discipline the wage function, the strength of the spillover in affecting the income of the kids. And so we are using two numbers. We are going to use the fact that if you take families in the 25th percentile of the population, in the bottom 25th percentile of the population, so the poor ones, they are going to have an effect of 10% higher income when they grow up. And if you take families in the 75th percentile, you're going to have a 6% higher income when they grow up. Okay, and we target these two numbers as well. Okay, so how much time do I have? So we are gonna, to match the target of the Chetty and Andre data, we try to replicate in the model what they do in the data. So we are gonna define movers, because they focus on movers in the data. So we're gonna find movers as parents who choose a neighbor that is different from the neighbors where they did grow up. And then we look at those movers and calculate what is the income of their kids if they were living in A or B, and do the difference and normalize that. Here is a bunch of parameters that you can look at, we estimate, and here is the result of our calibration. So this is the top panel shows inequality, the Gini coefficient, the bottom panel shows segregation. And we target that 1980 inequality and segregation are as in the data, but we don't target the other dates. We just choose the size of the skill premium shock to match the increase in skill premium. And we get a pretty good pattern from inequality, actually surprisingly good pattern for inequality that resemble the data. Segregation goes in the right direction. There is a little bit larger margin of error, but I guess given the stylized nature of the model, this is in the bulk of what's happening. So we are pretty happy with this sanity check. And now, so we have looked at so in response to the skill premium, of course, we see an increase in inequality, an increase in segregation, both in the data and in the model. And then what we see also in the model is a decrease in intergenerational mobility that is in line with this fading of the American Dream data that Chetty shows us. And we see two other things that are important for our mechanism. One is that we see an increase in the gap between the rental rate in the rich neighborhood and the poor neighbor. That is exactly what generates this increase in the income segregation. So this is the general equilibrium effect. And the other thing that we see that is important for the spillover effect, the feedback effect between segregation and income, is that this increase in gap in the rental rate generates an increase in gap in spillovers between the two neighbors. So make the neighbor A even richer, even better, and neighbor B even worse. And so this is actually, it becomes better, but less than neighbor A, so the gap increases. And this generates the feedback on inequality. Okay, so let me skip that. Let's look at the main counterfactual. So now the question is how much, let's go back to the main question I started with, which was how much does segregation amplify the response of inequality to the skill premium shock? So to answer this question, we can run different counterfactual. The main counterfactual we thought of that we think is a better suited to answer this question is, let's shut down the residential choice after the shock. So basically, we shut down the sorting of people and see what happened to inequality, and if we shut down that. And so basically, if we randomly relocate all the households at any time after the shock in the two neighborhoods. And then we look at what happened instead in our model. We look at the difference between the two, and that should give us how much of the increase in inequality was due to the sorting effect and the residential choice effect. Okay, so here is what we get. So we get the blue line is the model, is inequality in the model. And the red line now is the inequality in a model where we randomly relocate families. So you see that inequality in that in this counterfactual increases still, but increases by less. And if you calculate the cumulative increase between 1980 and 2010, this difference contributes for 28% of the increase in inequality. Okay, it is roughly 12% if you look at that, but it becomes bigger as time goes by, because of the effects through the feedback effect are gonna keep going in time, and are gonna amplify the original shock as time goes by. Now you can think about different exercises to kind of check the robustness of this order of magnitude effect. And two alternative exercises that we thought about were, one is let's just shut down completely the spillover. So shut down the spillover completely, of course, is a bit extreme, because this means that there is not only there is no local spillover, but there is not even global spillover. In the previous exercise, if you want, you could interpret that as changing the spillover from being local to global, because all the neighbors are going to be the same, and so there is still going to be a spillover in the human capital accumulation, but it's going to be the same for both neighborhoods. Now, instead, we are completely shutting that down, and so just impose that the parameter beta 1, that is the one that governs the effect of the spillover, is 0. The other way we can do it is just fix the local spillover at the level of the spillover before the shock, and not allow the endogenous change in the spillover that we experience because of the general equilibrium effect. So here is what we get. So in the top panel is inequality. So again, the blue line is the model. The red line is the exercise with the fixed spillover. Okay, so this is like saying the spillover did not change. People can still relocate, but the spillover does not move endogenously. Okay, so you still see an effect there that is, again, this is similar in order of magnitude to the previous one. It's roughly 27% if you calculate the cumulative between 1980 and 2010. So a different way of looking at that, but it gives us a similar order of magnitude. Of course, if you completely shut down the spillover, you're going to have a much bigger effect. We think that this is not the interesting exercise, but it's useful to understand the mechanics behind the results, right? So there are different layers that different things that affect the spillover, the response of inequality. One is that the presence of spillover at all. If there is spillover, even if it's global, you're going to have a response in segregation by income because of the increase in inequality, because people can enjoy more of that. But then on the top of that, you're going to have an effect that comes from the endogenous change in the spillover. So there are different layers of the effect that we try to explain in the paper. So if you're interested, you can look at that. And now the last thing, the other thing that we do is, we can try to assess how important is the general equilibrium effect. And so the blue line is the model. What is this? This is the gap. This is the ratio of the spillover between A and B. Okay, so the spillover in A and B, as the ratio of the spillovers has been increasing, and this is why we are going to have this feedback effect from increasing residential segregation to increasing inequality, back to increasing inequality, and so forth. But how much of this increase in the gap is really due to the general equilibrium effect? Because there is a mechanical effect also that matters, that generates an increase in that spillover. And it is just think about it, like there are richer people living in A, poorer people living in B. Now, if there is more inequality, the richer people become more rich and the poor people become less poor, more poor or less rich. And so this is if average income of the families that live in the neighborhoods affect the spillover, this creates naturally an increase in the gap in the spillover. So this is a mechanical effect that is there and is present. And this is the green line. Then there is a red line where you have a partial equilibrium effect. So on top of that, you're going to have an endogenous choice of where to live. There is going to be some sorting there that is driven where to live and which type of education, how much education to get. And so this is going to, more inequality is going to also generate an increase in the gap because of that, because you're going to generate some increase in inequality coming from that effect that is going to increase the gap. But then there is going to be the general equilibrium effect that comes from the fact that the rental rate in A increases, and so this generates an additional increase in residential segregation by income, and that part increase even more the gap between the spillover in A and B. And actually this the composition shows that the general equilibrium effect is quite sizable. It's roughly explain roughly 45% of the increase in the gap between SA and SP. The ratios only of SA and SP. So it's an important effect. We also run the model, recalibrate the model with no spillover, and we obtain that comparing our model with the model with no spillover, we are going to have a roughly 25%, I think, increase overall in inequality due to the spillover. Okay, so hopefully I convinced you that with a bunch of different counterfactual exercise, we are convinced that the order of magnitude of the effect of segregation on the rising inequality on top of the mechanical effect coming from the shock is sizable. And is around the order of magnitude of 27-28%, which is an important number. So we have to think carefully about policies that affect these numbers and affect segregation, residential segregation. Also because another thing that we show in the paper is that intergenerational mobility is going to be affected by these dynamics in an adverse way. And so this is going to be, in that sense, the end of the American dream we talk about in the title, if we don't do anything for that. There are other papers, in particular, I highlight here the paper by Heckert and Kleinberg that take the quantitative side of the exercise even more extreme. They actually structurally estimate a spatial model similar to the one that I've shown you to address the question of which type of policies or could we do some change some funding schooling policies and obtain some improvement in terms of intergenerational mobility or inequality and segregation. Unfortunately, the result is not so big, meaning that it's not very optimistic, and the equalization of school funding across all students have some positive effect, but not particularly sizable. But I think in general, there is a lot of room here for future work on a model of spatial model that highlight, emphasize the role of residential segregation and try to understand effects on inequality, intergenerational mobility, labor market access, education, and other important dimensions that affect the functioning of the economy. And I think that there is this booming in microdata that is really amazing and really opens up a new opportunity for people who want to use this microdata to discipline this model and try to understand more carefully or analyze more carefully different type of policies that can help reduce this inequality and low level of intergenerational mobility. And again, another dimension that I haven't focused on, but I think it would be important to focus on in the future is also racial segregation. I haven't analyzed that, but I think that's also another important measure. I think that you had a lecture on that, so I'm sure you're on top of that. Thank you. If there is any other questions.
Thank you, Veronica, for a really great lecture. There is a few questions. We only have about 3 or 4 minutes left, but we'll try and squeeze in a few. The first one was kind of very much about your paper with Alessandra, where you assume that the housing elasticity is that housing is in tighter supply in the location into which more affluent people are moving. And there's a question from Francisco saying that usually the housing supply elasticity is like more restrictive in the center of cities and less restrictive in the suburbs where rich people tend to live. And whether you had any thoughts on that. So.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that that's definitely a stark assumption, and we are working now on relaxing that assumption, have a more general supply elasticity, housing supply elasticity. I think, though, that the important thing is that there is always some inelasticity in the neighborhood, because it's true. I mean, in the housing supply in the neighborhood, in this dimension. So think about schooling. First of all, the number of school seats in a school are given, so you can increase put more high rise or increase in space. But if a good public school has a limited amount of seats, either you create a new school, which will create some time. So it's true that in the longer run, this age is probably more elastic than in the short run. But I think this long run, it may take a long time to build a new school for the new occupants of the neighborhood. And this is true even if you enlarge in space. And even more, if you think about suburbs, part of the story may be public schooling, but part of the story may be bumping in other kids that are going to give you that are going to instill in you social norms, so they're going to peer effects and so forth. And so if you have a large space, that effect is kind of shading off. So it's a stark assumption, but I think captures something that is real, and I agree we can relax that and use some data to discipline that. But I think the important thing is that there is some cost of expanding the size of a neighborhood that is going to translate in a lower spillover or in a higher cost on accessing those features of the neighborhood that are going to impact the education return of your kids.
Great, thank you very much for that. I think we have about a minute left, so I will yield to Daniel for some last words before we close here.
So Veronica, thank you very much for this fantastic lecture. It's given us plenty of food for thought. This is a very exciting literature. So with that, we're going to close for today, and we look forward to seeing many of you, or hopefully all of you, back next week for our final lecture by Esteban Rossi Hansberg. And with that, thank you and good night from London.